June 3, 1942. The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck of the USS Enterprise. As Commander Wade McCluskey adjusted his flight goggles and peered toward the horizon. In less than 24 hours, the most decisive naval battle of the Pacific War would begin, though none of the 30,000 men scattered across the vast ocean knew it yet. The fate of nations hung in the balance, suspended somewhere between the crystalline waters of the Pacific and the war rooms of admirals who had never seen combat. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood in his Pearl Harbor headquarters, studying intelligence reports that would make lesser men tremble. The Japanese were coming, not just a few ships, but the largest naval armada ever assembled in the Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant architect of Pearl Harbor, was bringing 4 aircraft carriers, 11 battleships, and over 200 aircraft to crush what remained of the American Pacific Fleet. According to intercepted communications decoded by Station Hypo, the target was Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand that had suddenly become the most important piece of real estate in the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort, the unsung hero of American cryptanalysis, had spent weeks breaking Japanese naval codes in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters. His team of codebreakers worked around the clock, surviving on coffee and determination, knowing that every decoded message could save thousands of American lives. When they finally cracked the designation AF as Midway, Rochefort had given Nimitz the greatest gift any admiral could receive: foreknowledge of his enemy's intentions. The Americans had precious little to work with. Task Force 16, under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, centered around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet. Task Force 17, commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher aboard the hastily repaired Yorktown, provide additional support. Against Yamamoto's overwhelming force, the Americans could muster only 3 carriers, and their escorts at David facing not 1, but 4 Goliaths. Captain Mark Mitcher paced the bridge of the Hornet, watching his pilots prepare for what many believed would be their final mission. The ship's air group had never seen real combat, but they carried themselves with the quiet confidence of men who knew they were fighting for something larger than themselves. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle's recent raid on Tokyo had proven that American resolve remained unbroken. But this battle would determine whether that resolve could translate into victory. On Midway itself, Colonel Harold Shannon commanded a mixed garrison of Marines, Navy personnel, and Army Air Forces pilots flying obsolete aircraft. The atolls to tiny islands, eastern and sand, bristled with whatever defenses could be hastily assembled: anti-aircraft guns, coastal artillery, and a motley collection of fighters and bombers that would have been museum pieces in peacetime. As dawn broke on June 3rd, reconnaissance aircraft from both fleets began their deadly dance of discovery. Lieutenant Howard 80, flying a Catalina patrol bomber from Midway, spotted the first elements of the Japanese fleet approaching from the northwest. His terse radio message, many planes heading Midway bearing 3-0. Distance 150 would echo through history as the opening notes of the symphony of destruction about to unfold. The trap was set. Yamamoto believed he was hunting the remnants of a broken fleet, but instead, he was sailing into the most carefully planned ambush in naval history. The next 4 days would witness courage, sacrifice, tactical brilliance, on a scale that would reshape not just the Pacific theater, but the entire course of the Second World War. June 4th, 1942. Dawn. The pre-dawn darkness of June 4th was shattered by the roar of 108 Japanese aircraft lifting off from the flight decks of Akagi, Aga, Hairyu, and Soryu. Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagumo, the same man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, watched with satisfaction as his strike force formed up in the pale morning light. Leading the formation was Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, a veteran pilot whose calm voice would soon be reporting the success of Japan's latest victory. At exactly 6:30 in the morning, radar operators on Midway detected the incoming formation. While it was still 93 miles away, air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll as every available aircraft scrambled to meet the threat. Major Floyd Parks led 26 obsolete Brewster F-2A Buffalo fighters into what everyone knew would be a hopeless battle against the superior Japanese Zeros. The American pilots, many of them fresh from flight school, climbed toward their destiny with grim determination. The aerial battle over Midway was a slaughter. The lumbering Buffaloes were no match for the agile Zeros, and within minutes, 15 American fighters were plummeting toward the ocean in flames. Major Parks himself was among the casualties, his aircraft disintegrating under the guns of Lieutenant Saburo Shindo Zero. Only 2 Buffalo fighters would return to Midway intact, their pilots bearing witness to the devastating superiority of Japanese air power. While the air battle raged overhead, Tominaga's bombers swept in low over Eastern Island. The thunder of explosions rolled across the atoll, as hangars burst into flames and fuel storage tanks erupted in towering columns of black smoke. The powerhouse, mess hall, and seaplane hangar were reduced to twisted wreckage within minutes. Yet, despite the devastation, the crucial runway remained operational, and most of Midway's aircraft had already launched. Captain Richard Fleming led a squadron of obsolete Vought SBDU Vindicator dive bombers in a desperate counterattack against the Japanese carriers. The wind indicators, as they were derisively nicknamed, faced an impossible task. Flying aircraft that were already outdated before the war began, Fleming's pilots pressed their attack with suicidal courage. Anti-aircraft fire from the Japanese fleet filled the sky with deadly flowers of steel and smoke, but still they came on. According to historical records from the Naval War College, Fleming's aircraft was hit repeatedly during its final dive, yet he continued his attack until his Vindicator crashed directly into the heavy cruiser Makuma's forward turret. The explosion killed Fleming instantly, but his sacrifice would later contribute to the cruiser's eventual destruction. His posthumous Medal of Honor citation would read simply, "With his plane on fire and his controls shot away, he continued his dive to make sure his bomb found its target." Major Lofton Henderson, commanding Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241, led 16 Douglas SPD Dauntless dive bombers in another wave of attacks. Henderson, flying an aircraft he had never piloted in combat before, was struck down early in the attack, his Dauntless exploding in a ball of orange flame. Yet his squadron mates pressed on, their bombs falling harmlessly around the Japanese carriers as Zero fighters tore through their formations. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Sweeney's B-17 Flying Fortresses, attacking from high altitude, achieved no hits despite dropping dozens of bombs. The lesson was becoming clear. High-altitude bombing against moving ships was nearly useless. No matter how brave the crews or how modern the aircraft, the Japanese carriers continued their deadly dance across the blue Pacific, untouched and seemingly invincible. By 8:30 in the morning, Tominaga was radioing back to Nagumo with a request that would change the course of the battle. There is need for a second attack. The airfield remained operational, and American resistance was proving more stubborn than expected. Nagumo faced a crucial decisionry: arm his aircraft with land attack weapons for a second strike on Midway, or keep them armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes in case American ships appeared. Unknown to the Japanese admiral, American task forces were already racing toward their rendezvous with destiny. The first phase of the battle was complete, but the real test was yet to come. June 4, 1942, mid-morning. At 7-20-8 in the morning, the course of the Pacific War pivoted on a single radio transmission. Lieutenant Robert Dixon, flying a scout plane from the USS Yorktown, spotted the Japanese mobile force and transmitted the message that would electrify the American fleet. Scratch one flat top. Dixon to carrier. Scratch one flat top. But Dixon was premature. No Japanese carriers had been sunk yet. The real action was just beginning. Aboard the flagship Akagi, Vice Admiral Nagumo found himself caught in an impossible tactical dilemma. His first wave had attacked Midway successfully, but Lieutenant Tominaga's request for a second strike meant rearming his remaining aircraft with land attack bombs. However, at 7:40 in the morning, the cruiser-toned scout plane finally reported what Nagumo feared most. 10 ships, apparently enemy, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. The Japanese admiral hesitated, a hesitation that would prove fatal. Should he launch immediately with whatever aircraft were ready, or wait until his entire strike force could be properly armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes? Precious minutes ticked by as ordnance crews frantically switched weapons loads. Bombs and torpedoes scattered across hangar decks in organized chaos. The decision to rearm would prove to be one of the most crucial mistakes in naval history. Meanwhile, the American carriers were launching everything they had. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from the Enterprise, made the aggressive decision to strike immediately. Even though it meant his aircraft would be operating at extreme range, Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led 14 Devastator torpedo bombers from the Enterprise, while Lieutenant Commander John Waldron prepared to take his 15 Devastators from the Hornet into what he privately knew would be a death ride. Waldron had written a letter to his pilots the night before, and his words now seem prophetic. If there is only one plane left to make a final run-in, I want that man to go in and get a hit. The stocky pilot from South Dakota had trained his squadron relentlessly, and now that training would be put to the ultimate test. At 8:20, his Squadron 8 launched into the blue Pacific morning, heading toward a date with immortality. The first American attack wave was a disaster. Waldron's 15 Devastators approached the Japanese fleet without fighter escort, their obsolete torpedo bombers crawling through the sky at barely 110 miles per hour. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, led by Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Ataya, fell upon the Americans with savage efficiency. Zero after zero dove through the formation, their 20mm cannons and 7.7mm machine guns tearing the Devastators apart. One by one, Waldron's aircraft plunged into the Pacific. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Squadron 8, watched helplessly as his squadron mates died around him. His own aircraft, riddled with bullets, crashed into the ocean near the Japanese fleet. Gay would spend the next 30 hours floating in the water, hidden under his seat cushion, watching the greatest naval battle in history unfold around him. The slaughter continued as more American torpedo squadrons arrived. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay's Squadron 6 from Enterprise suffered almost as badly, with 10 of 14 aircraft shot down. The Japanese defenders were becoming overconfident, their fighters drawn down to low altitude to deal with the seemingly endless stream of slow-moving torpedo bombers. But the American sacrifice was not in vain. It's documented in Samuel Eliot Morrison's Definitive History of United States Naval Operations in World War II. The torpedo attacks were unknowingly setting up the decisive blow. Every Zero fighter was now at sea level, their ammunition expended, their fuel running low. The Japanese carriers were scattered, maneuvering violently to avoid torpedoes, their flight decks cluttered with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. High above the chaos, unnoticed by the Japanese defenders, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey was leading 37 dive bombers from the Enterprise in search of the enemy fleet. At 10-20-2 in the morning, McCluskey spotted the wake of the Japanese destroyer Arashi, racing to rejoin the main force after depth charging an American submarine. Following that wake northward like a highway in the sky, McCluskey was about to deliver the most decisive blow in naval aviation history. The stage was set for a reversal of fortune that would shock the world. June 4th, 1942, late morning. Behind him, the Enterprise dive bomber. Squadrons followed in a textbook attack that would be studied in naval academies for generations. What happened in the next 6 minutes would transform the Pacific War from a desperate American defense into an inevitable march toward victory. The Combat Air Patrol was still at sea level, engaged with the last of the American torpedo bombers, leaving the carriers virtually defenseless against high-altitude attack. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise squadrons, had made the crucial decision to split his force. He took Bombing Squadron 6 against the Kaga, while Lieutenant Best's Bombing Squadron 3 dove on the Akagi. The first 1,000-pound bomb to hit Kaga struck directly amidships, detonating among aircraft loaded with fuel and ordnance. The explosion was so violent that it lifted the massive carrier's flight deck like a piece of cardboard, hurling aircraft and men into the air. Secondary explosions rippled through the ship as aviation gasoline and ammunition cooked off in a devastating chain reaction. Within minutes, the pride of the Japanese fleet was transformed into a floating inferno. Her flight deck twisted into unrecognizable wreckage. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's Squadron 3 from Yorktown arrived at the same moment, diving on the carrier Soryu with clockwork precision. Leslie had lost his bomb during the launch, but his pilots pressed home their attacks with deadly accuracy. At least 3 direct hits turned Soryu into another blazing wreck, her hangar deck erupting in explosions that could be seen for miles across the Pacific. The carnage was beyond anything naval warfare had ever witnessed. In the space of 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were reduced to burning hulks. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto, commanding officer of Soryu, chose to go down with his ship rather than abandon his men. According to Japanese naval records, he was last seen standing on his bridge, singing the national anthem as flames engulfed the superstructure around him. His final radio message was typically stoic. "I am staying aboard. You men save yourselves and continue to serve the Emperor." Aboard the burning Akagi, Admiral Nagumo was finally convinced by his staff to transfer his flag to the light cruiser Nagara. The man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor was forced to watch helplessly as his fleet burned around him. Captain Teijiro Aoki, Aoki's commanding officer, remained aboard his doomed ship, supervising firefighting efforts that everyone knew were futile. The carrier that had been Japan's most powerful symbol of naval might was now a drifting tomb. Only the carrier Hiryu remained operational, and her commander, Rear Admiral Taemon Yamaguchi, was determined to extract revenge. At 10:54, Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 dive bombers from Hiryu in a desperate counterattack against the American fleet. Their target was the Yorktown, the carrier that had been hastily repaired after the Battle of the Coral Sea, and had arrived at Midway with work crews still aboard. The Japanese attack was pressed home with the same suicidal courage their enemies had shown earlier. Despite heavy anti-aircraft fire and determined fighter resistance, 3 bombs struck Yorktown's flight deck. The explosions knocked out her boilers and started serious fires. But the American damage control parties went to work with practiced efficiency. Within 2 hours, Yorktown was making 20 knots again, her flight deck patched and operational. But Yamaguchi wasn't finished. At 1:31 in the afternoon, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led 10 torpedo bombers in what he knew would be his final mission. His own aircraft was running on fumes, damaged from the morning attack on Midway, but still, he pressed on. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side, flooding her engine rooms and leaving her dead in the water. The Americans had lost their first carrier of the battle, but the score was still dramatically in their favor. 3 Japanese carriers lay burning on the Pacific, while 1 American carrier sat damaged but salvageable. The question now was whether the 4th Japanese carrier could be found and destroyed before she escaped to fight another day. June 4th, 1942, afternoon. As smoke columns from 3 burning Japanese carriers darkened the western sky, the hunt began for the elusive Hiryu. Admiral Raymond Spruance, now commanding both American carrier task forces after Admiral Fletcher's flagship was crippled, faced a critical decision. Should he pursue the remaining Japanese carrier aggressively, or consolidate his forces to protect the damaged Yorktown? The aggressive choice would define Spruance's reputation for the rest of his career. Lieutenant Samuel Adams, piloting a scout bomber from Enterprise, spotted Hiryu at 2:45 in the afternoon, steaming northward at high speed. His radio transmission galvanized the American fleet. 1 carrier, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 4 destroyers, course 00, speed 25. The last Japanese flat top had been found, and every available American aircraft prepared for what many hoped would be the final act of the drama. Rear Admiral Taemon Yamaguchi aboard Hiryu knew his fate was sealed. But the veteran commander was determined to inflict maximum damage before his ship joined her sisters on the bottom of the Pacific. Yamaguchi, one of Japan's most respected naval officers, had graduated second in his class from the Naval Academy and had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of decisive battle. He would not go down without a fight worthy of the samurai tradition. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led 24 dive bombers from Enterprise in the final attack of the day. Behind them came 14 more dauntless dive bombers from the patched-up Yorktown, their pilots eager to avenge their ship's damage. At 5:05 in the afternoon, Gallagher pushed over into his dive from 19,000 feet. Hiryu growing larger in his bomb sight with each passing second, the Japanese carrier tried desperately to evade the diving Americans, her helmsman throwing the ship into violent turns, while anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with deadly bursts of steel. But the American pilots had learned hard lessons during the morning's attacks, and their approach was nearly perfect. 4 direct hits struck Hiryu within minutes, transforming her flight deck into a crater-pocked wasteland. The explosion was so violent that it buckled the ship's hull and knocked out all power. Within minutes, Hiryu was listing heavily to starboard, her magazines detonating in secondary explosions that illuminated the darkening Pacific like a deadly fireworks display. As documented in the official war diary of the Japanese combined fleet, Admiral Yamaguchi made the decision that would cement his place in naval history. Rather than abandon ship, he chose to remain aboard Hiryu, with Captain Tomio Kaku, the ship's commanding officer. Both men retired to Yamaguchi's cabin, where they shared a final cup of sake before the carrier slipped beneath the waves at 9:05 the following morning. Meanwhile, the damaged Yorktown presented a different kind of drama. Captain Elliot Buckmaster had ordered abandoned ship when it appeared the carrier might capsize, but the sturdy vessel refused to sink. Salvage operations began immediately, with the destroyer Hamann alongside providing power and pumping out flooded compartments. For a brief moment, it seemed the battle-scarred carrier might be saved. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, leader of Yorktown's fighter squadron, had introduced a revolutionary new tactic during the day's fighting. The Thatch Weave, a defensive maneuver where two fighters supported each other against multiple attackers, had proven highly effective against the previously dominant Japanese Zeros. His innovation would be adopted throughout the American fleet and would help level the playing field in aerial combat. As night fell on June 4th, the greatest carrier battle in history was effectively over. For Japanese carriers lay on the bottom of the Pacific, along with over 200 aircraft and many of Japan's most experienced pilots and aircrew. The Americans had lost Yorktown and approximately 150 aircraft. But more importantly, they had retained their two remaining carriers and most of their aircrew. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship Yamato hundreds of miles away, finally grasped the magnitude of the disaster. The architect of Pearl Harbor had gambled everything on a decisive victory at Midway, and he had lost. His first instinct was to continue the battle, bringing his battleships forward to engage the American fleet in a night surface action. But his subordinates convinced him that discretion was the better part of valor. At 2:55 in the morning of June 5th, Yamamoto issued the order that marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat. The Midway operation is canceled. The most powerful fleet ever assembled by the Imperial Japanese Navy turned around and headed for home, leaving behind the burning wrecks of its most valuable ships and the shattered dreams of Pacific dominance. But the battle was not quite over. One final act of drama remained to be played out beneath the Pacific swells. June 5th-7th, 1942. The damaged Yorktown floated like a wounded whale in the early morning calm of June 5th. Her list reduced to 2 degrees as salvage crews worked frantically to save the historic carrier. Captain Elliot Buckmaster had returned aboard with a skeleton crew, determined to bring his ship home. The destroyer Hammond nestled alongside her generators providing power, while her pumps fought the relentless Pacific. For 12 precious hours, it seemed the Americans might perform a miracle of seamanship and save their wounded flat top. 300 feet below the surface, Lieutenant Commander Jahachi Tanabe piloted the Japanese submarine I-1 6A through the scattered debris of the Great Battle. The veteran submariner had been stalking the American fleet for hours, its periscope breaking the surface only long enough to fix his position before disappearing again into the blue depths. Tanabe, one of Japan's most experienced submarine commanders, saw an opportunity to salvage something from the disaster that had befallen the Japanese fleet. At 1:36 in the afternoon, Tanabe achieved perfect firing position. The stationary Yorktown and her escorting destroyer presented an ideal target for his experienced torpedo crew. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3, Fire 4. For Type 95 torpedoes streaked through the water at 45 knots, their wakeless approach making them nearly impossible to detect until it was too late. The first torpedo struck Hammond directly amidships, breaking the destroyer's back with a thunderous explosion that killed 81 sailors instantly. The second and third torpedoes found Yorktown's starboard side, opening massive holes below her waterline and dooming the salvage effort. The fourth torpedo missed, but 3 hits were more than enough to seal the fate of both ships. Hammond sank within 4 minutes, her depth charges exploding as she plunged toward the bottom. The underwater detonations killed many survivors in the water and further damaged Yorktown's hull. Watching from the bridge, Captain Buckmaster knew his ship was lost. It's a carrier that had fought at Coral Sea and Midway, that had launched the bombers that helped destroy the Japanese fleet, would not see another dawn. As Yorktown began her final plunge, Chief Aviation Machinist's mate Albert would remain at his post in the engine room, ensuring the classified equipment was properly destroyed. Wood's devotion to duty would earn him a posthumous Navy Cross, but more importantly, it exemplified the spirit that had carried the Americans through their darkest hours. His sacrifice and that of hundreds of other sailors and airmen had purchased something beyond price. Time for America's industrial might to mobilize. The heavy cruisers Mikuma and Megami, damaged during the previous day's action, were fleeing westward when Captain Richard Fleming's damaged dive bomber had crashed into Makuma's forward turret. Now both ships were struggling to reach safety, their speed reduced by battle damage and steering difficulties. Captain John Collins, commanding the submarine Nautilus, had been stalking the retreating Japanese forces since dawn on June 6th. At 1:15 in the afternoon, Collins achieved the perfect setup. Mogami was zigzagging erratically, her damaged steering making evasive maneuvers nearly impossible. Collins fired for torpedoes at close range, but incredibly, all four either missed or failed to explode. The Japanese cruiser continued her painful journey westward, unaware of how close she had come to joining her sisters on the bottom. Enterprise and Hornet launched their final strikes of the battle on June 6th, determined to finish off the crippled cruisers. Lieutenant Commander Walter Roddy led 26 dive bombers in a textbook attack on the struggling Japanese ships. 5 direct hits on Makuma turned the heavy cruiser into a blazing wreck, while additional damage to Mogami ensured she would be out of action for months. According to the official history published by the Navy Department in 1949, Makuma became the first Japanese heavy cruiser sunk by aircraft, demonstrating the new reality of naval warfare. The age of the battleship was ending, and air power had become the decisive factor in naval combat. The lessons learned at Midway would reshape naval doctrine for generations to come. On the morning of June 7th, Yorktown finally succumbed to her wounds. Rolling over and sliding beneath the Pacific at dawn, the carrier that had fought valiantly in 3 major battles took with her the hopes and dreams of the men who had served aboard her. But she also carried something else to the bottom, proof that American shipyards could build carriers faster than Japanese torpedoes could sink them. The Battle of Midway was over. In 4 days of combat, the Japanese had lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, and over 3,000 men, including many of their most experienced pilots and aircrew. The Americans had lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and approximately 300 personnel. More importantly, Japan had lost the strategic initiative in the Pacific, while America had gained the confidence that victory was not only possible, but inevitable. June 7th, 1942, and beyond. As the sun rose over the empty Pacific on June 7th, 1942, the waters around Midway told the story of the greatest naval victory in American history. Oil slicks marked the graves of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, while floating debris bore silent testimony to the price of Admiral Yamamoto's gamble. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor sat in his cabin aboard the battleship Yamato, composing the telegram that would inform Tokyo of the disaster that had befallen the Imperial Navy. Admiral Chester Nimitz received the first complete reports of the battle while standing on the balcony of his Pearl Harbor headquarters, watching the sun set over the harbor where the Pacific War had begun 6 months earlier. The taciturn commander allowed himself a rare smile as he read the damage assessments. For enemy carriers sunk, 1 American carrier lost. It was a victory beyond his most optimistic projections. More importantly, it was proof that American fighting men, properly led and equipped, could defeat the previously invincible Japanese. The strategic implications of Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. Japan had lost not just ships and aircraft, but something far more valuable: the core of her experienced naval aviation. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, who had led the first attack on Midway, was dead. Commander Mitsuo Fukita, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, was hospitalized with appendicitis and missed the battle entirely. Hundreds of veteran pilots and aircrew, who had trained for years in the rigid Japanese system, were gone forever. According to intelligence analyses declassified in the 1970s, Japan had trained only 3,500 carrier pilots before the war began. The pilot training program that had produced such skilled aviators took 2 years to complete, and the Japanese Navy had no plans to expand it significantly. In contrast, the United States was already graduating thousands of new pilots monthly from training programs that would eventually produce over 60,000 naval aviators during the war. Captain Mark Mitcher, commanding officer of Hornet, understood the significance of what had occurred better than most. The veteran naval officer had watched his untested air group perform magnificently under fire, proving that American training methods could produce effective combat pilots in months rather than years, as he wrote in his post-battle report. The enemy's superiority in individual pilot skill has been overrated. Our pilots, properly trained and aggressively led, are second to none. Emperor Hirohito received word of the Midway defeat in the ancient ritual silence of the imperial palace. The man considered divine by his people listened without expression as Admiral Osami Nagano, Chief of Naval General Staff, detailed the magnitude of the disaster. For carriers, hundreds of aircraft, thousands of men all, lost in a single day's fighting. For the first time since the war began, Hirohito asked the question that would haunt Japan for the next 3 years. Can we still win this war? The answer, though no one dared speak it aloud in the imperial presence, was already becoming clear. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort's codebreakers had not only won the Battle of Midway through their intelligence triumph, they had also demonstrated that Japanese naval communications could be consistently penetrated. Future Japanese operations would be conducted under the constant threat of American foreknowledge, strategic disadvantage that would prove insurmountable. In Washington, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox announced the victory to a jubilant press corps, though strict censorship prevented him from revealing the full extent of Japanese losses. President Franklin Roosevelt, meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Oval Office, authorized the acceleration of shipbuilding programs that would ultimately produce over 100 aircraft carriers during the war. The industrial might that Admiral Yamamoto had hoped to cripple at Pearl Harbor was now fully awakened and turning toward the Pacific. The human cost of victory was not forgotten. In small towns across America, telegraph operators delivered news that would forever change families and communities. Mrs. John Waldron of Spartanburg, South Carolina, learned that her husband had led Torpedo Squadron 8 to immortality above the Japanese carriers. Mrs. Lofton Henderson of Baltimore, Maryland, received word that her husband had died leading his Marines in their first and last combat mission. Each telegram represented not just a personal tragedy, but a sacrifice that had helped turn the tide of the Pacific War. On Midway itself, Colonel Harold Shannon's garrison began the grim task of burying their dead and rebuilding their defenses. The 2 tiny islands had been transformed overnight from an obscure refueling stop into a symbol of American determination. Within weeks, the atoll would be reinforced with additional aircraft and personnel, becoming an advanced base for the long campaign ahead. The Battle of Midway had ended Japan's 6-month rampage across the Pacific and marked the beginning of America's island-hopping campaign toward the Japanese home islands. From Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima, from the Philippine Sea to Okinawa, every subsequent battle would be fought in the shadow of that decisive June morning when dive bombers from Enterprise in Yorktown had shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. As Admiral Nimitz wrote in his final report on the battle, Midway was not just a victory of ships and planes, but a victory of intelligence, training, and above all, the indomitable spirit of American fighting men. This account draws upon official U.S. Navy records, Japanese naval archives, and the comprehensive histories compiled by Samuel Eliot Morison and other military historians in the decades following the war. The Battle of Midway remains one of the most thoroughly documented naval engagements in history, a testament to its crucial importance in the Pacific theater of World War II.